This is the first workshop in the 2024 New York State World Languages Professional Learning Series. My name is Candace Black, and I'm your World Language Associate in the Office of Bilingual Education and World Languages of the New York State Education Department. Welcome to Principles and Guidelines for Adopting or Creating Locally Developed Benchmark Assessments for Checkpoint A Modern Languages by Dr. Joanne O'Toole, Bill Heller, and Dr. Lori Langer de Ramirez. In this session, the presenters will explain the general principles and protocols outlined in the NYSED-OBEWL document, Principles and Guidelines for Adopting or Creating Locally Developed Benchmark Assessments for Checkpoint A Modern Languages. This document provides guidance to local educational agencies and regional and statewide consortia for the creation of Checkpoint A benchmark assessments for modern languages aligned to the revised New York State Learning Standards for World Languages. Benchmark assessments are those assessments used to award one high school credit for middle school students prior to entering grade 9 and to meet the 1 credit graduation requirement. Checkpoint A benchmark assessments must be aligned to the revised standards for the June 2025 administration. Our workshop presenters today are Dr. Joanne O'Toole, Bill Heller, and Dr. Lori Langer de Ramirez. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to invite Joanne to begin the webinar.
Thank you very much, Candy, and thank you everyone for being here today. I am going to repeat what Candy said, which is the request to not enter items into the chat and to remain muted throughout today's session. It's very robust. We need everyone to be able to attend without distraction. Very briefly, we want to mention that today's session is specific to modern languages other than ASL. You can see on this slide that on Tuesday, March 5th, we will have our webinar on principles and guidelines for adopting or creating locally developed benchmark assessments for Checkpoint A for classical languages. And forthcoming, yet to be announced, is the session specifically for ASL, but we will make you aware when that is going to be presented. And as always, these sessions are recorded. We have a whole nother series of webinars for this coming spring. Standards in Action, Interpersonal Communication Strategies, February 27th. Presentational Communication Strategies, March 12th. These two webinars follow up on the webinar we did in the fall on interpretive communication strategies. Linguistic diversity in the heritage classroom, educational practices that celebrate home languages with Maria Quintanilla. This is a follow-up from our webinar on heritage languages last spring, as per your request. That will be April 24th, and we'll round out the semester with leveraging social justice approaches to affirm and support world language students with Pamela Wesley. So we're really excited. That's May 21st. As always, we ask that you keep your microphones muted. We will be using this folder icon to indicate when there is content in the Google folder, and off and on throughout today's session, Bill Heller will put the link to that Google folder in the chat. Please don't ask again because he'll keep putting it in there. Probably not so much in this webinar, but just at the very end, we will give you the opportunity to write your questions in the chat. Again, please do not use the chat during the session. And if you're having any technical difficulties, I hate to tell you it's on your end because we can all hear fine. So please, you can log off, log back on again, double check your concerns. And if you have particular things that you want to contribute or ask, maybe do that privately rather than with the whole group. Again, distraction will not be good for today's session. We've got a lot of content. So we have 3 goals for today, starting with I can identify purposes and guiding principles for Checkpoint A benchmark assessments. Secondly, I can identify the guidelines for Checkpoint A benchmark assessment development and implementation. And finally, I can identify the assessment formats and task designs for sections associated with each New York State Learning Standard for World Languages. So the document that you see in front of you, you will find in the Google folder. The Google folder again, Bill, can you just go back for 1 second? Backwards. Thank you. Um, this is the document that this entire webinar is about. And you'll find it in the Google folder. Again, Bill's putting that link in the chat. And the purpose of today's webinar is to interpret this document for you. It's a 6-page document to explain what we mean by the information found in this document and to illustrate it for you. There's another document that you will find in the folder that we'll be referencing throughout the session, and it is called Writing Quality Assessment Items for Interpretive, Interpersonal, and Presentational Communication. So we will make reference to that at times as well. So moving forward, this is what we suggest. As I've previously said, this is a very robust webinar. So we suggest that first you consider the information that we're sharing. Don't ask questions until you've engaged with the whole webinar. Then, on your own or with colleagues, read thoroughly the document, Principles and Guidelines for Adopting or Creating Locally Developed Benchmark Assessments for Checkpoint A. Also read the Writing Quality Assessment Quality Communication Tasks, a document that I referenced. And then watch the recording of today's webinar. It'll be available in about 2 weeks on the State Ed website, either alone or with colleagues, and then just pause it and refer to these 2 documents as you look at different sections of it again, because that will be the best way to fully understand all that we're sharing with you. So I want to go back to a slide we shared with you in the fall of 2022 when we first put out information about assessment, that there is a continuum of world language curricular assessments. These should be very familiar to you, starting with comprehension checks, those informal, intermediate probes for understanding. The formative assessments are informal or formal measures of learning in progress that we do every day. The summative assessments that are those formal measures of learning that the learning our learners have achieved by the end of given units of instruction. And proficiency assessments, the checkpoint benchmark assessments that simulate real-world language use, all of which move our learners towards proficiency development. What we're talking about today is the final one of these, the proficiency assessment that simulates real-world language use. And as you know, the standards implementation timeline had us start in September of 2023 with 7th grade or the first FLES Checkpoint A program. And the assessment for Checkpoint A falls at the end of 8th grade for the traditional 7th through 12 program, with the first Checkpoint A benchmark assessment. So this guidance is for LEAs, our local educational agencies, in other words, the school districts. And what this guidance does is it gives the school districts choices. They may determine that they want to develop their own locally developed Checkpoint A benchmark assessment. They could also decide that they want to purchase or acquire a Checkpoint A benchmark assessment from a regional or statewide consortium. If they do that, the regional or statewide consortium is also going to be using this guidance. They could also determine that they want to purchase an assessment from a commercial vendor. If they do the latter, then this is the guidance that we've provided, that an LEA may select from those commercial assessments already identified, evaluated, and approved by State Ed for meeting the standards for the 4+1 pathways requirement. And this page is linked to the page of the State Ed website that shows you which world language assessments have been approved, and there are assessments approved in 15 different languages. This guidance is built on 4 guiding principles. So everything that follows from here. The first of the 4 guiding principles is this: maintaining a valid and reliable assessment of checkpoint A in order to maintain the benchmark as a graduation requirement that all students can realistically attain in 2 years. Valid, that it's assessing the standards. Reliable, in that it is reflecting the checkpoint A descriptors for what a checkpoint A learner should know and be able to do. The second principle is that this assessment maintains fidelity to the language functions, topics, and performance indicators. Remember, each of our standards incorporates a language function, or excuse me, 1 or more, up to 5. We build with our New York State World Language themes and topics a meaningful context, and we design the assessment at a particular proficiency checkpoint, in this case, checkpoint A. And those performance indicators for categories 1 and 2 and 3, 4 languages happen to be the same at checkpoint A, novice mid to novice high proficiency. The third guiding principle is that we're considering pragmatic approaches and protocols for administration. In other words, we're trying to be practical about this, based on past practices that were shown to be successful, along with more recently introduced and current research-based practices. And finally, considering overall assessment and task designs that are user-friendly and can be realistically administered, completed, and scored within the end of the year timeline. In other words, user-friendly is both for the teacher and the learners. So who needs to take this assessment? The reality is the answer has not changed. Middle school students who are not exempted by IEPs, they will take this assessment at the conclusion of the 8th grade Checkpoint A course, and with the intention of being able to earn 1 high school credit as a middle schooler in fulfillment of the graduation requirement. And guidelines on administering this assessment? Well, what? It's an on-demand performance task. And there's 2 parts to when. First, during Regents exam dates, with the exception of the speaking. And the speaking would be administered in the final 10 weeks leading up to Regents Week, so the final 10 weeks of the academic calendar. And how? Following the traditional Regents exam protocols. So, what is the scope and the content of a benchmark assessment for Checkpoint A? Specific to the communication standards, I want to share this quote from the document. All communication standards, interpretive, interpersonal, and presentational communication, are assessed in the on-demand Checkpoint A benchmark assessment, although not all skills of these standards need to be included in the on-demand assessment. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. And in regard to the scope and content of the culture standards, Standard 4, relating cultural practices and products to perspectives, and Standard 5, cultural comparisons, here's again a quote from our document. Items for the culture standards are not addressed separately from the communication standards. Instead, items that assess the culture standards may be included in Standard 1, interpretive communication. And when selecting the themes and topics, you'll be using the New York State Themes and Topics for World Languages document. And as you can see with my red highlighting here, 13 of the topics of the 17 topics have been identified for checkpoint A. And the goal is that there's a sufficiently broad representation of those 13 topics within meaningful contexts used in the development of the assessment items. So how are these sections weighted? Again, we have the 3 communication standards: interpretive, interpersonal, presentational. The intention is that interpretive communication is 40% of the assessment. And you'll notice there's both interpretive reading and interpretive listening. And LEAs have the flexibility of how they want to distribute that 40%, with interpretive reading being 20 to 25%, interpretive listening 15 to 20%. Interpersonal communication, although there is such a thing as interpersonal writing, the only focus here is on interpersonal speaking, and that being 30% of the Checkpoint A benchmark assessment. Presentational communication is 30%. Presentational writing can be from 15 to 30%. Presentational speaking is optional, so you may choose to include it up to 15%, or you may choose not to include presentational communication. Excuse me, presentational speaking. You will include presentational communication. So again, this needs to be aligned to what it is that Checkpoint A is defined as per our New York State World Language Performance Indicators. And so Novice High is where we've situated the assessment items, and Novice Mid, there we go. So Novice High is our target, but Novice Mid has to also be considered passing, because if someone is performing at Checkpoint A, they're performing both at Novice High and Novice Mid. So that's something to keep in mind in designing the tasks. So at this point, we're going to take a closer look at each one of the communication standards, the items that would be associated with those, and the types of items that one might create in association with a given skill. So here is interpretive communication with the skill of reading. Again, 20 to 25% of the assessment. The guidance tells us that you are to assess the student's ability to understand authentic resources with visual supports at Novice High, and ask students to, as per our performance indicators, identify the topic and some details from short texts on familiar topics. You may assess culture standards 4 and 5 or not, and you may include some items in English, the authentic resource being in the target language, but with the questions and possible answers in English, or in the target language, or all in English. There are 3 different item types that are recommended: multiple choice, constructed response, or graphic organizer completion. And we've created examples to show you what those might look like. In terms of interpretive listening, similarly, we will assess the student's ability to understand audio input from authentic resources at Novice High, ask students to identify the topic and some details from short texts on familiar topics. These may be transcripts or scripts of authentic resources that have been read twice, or potentially short audio clips that are played twice. Again, they may assess the culture standards and may include some items in English, some in the target language, or they may be completely in English. Assessment item types include multiple choice, constructed response, image selection, or short checklist completion. So again, one of the documents that I mentioned to you was the one entitled Writing Quality Assessment Items. And this is a screenshot of the guidance given to you on developing multiple choice items. So an example for interpretive reading, we have an infographic that's specific to how much time children should use a tablet based on their age. You'll see directions for the task, the multiple choice task that the students are given, and then you will see 2 questions that follow from this one item. So important to keep in mind that it's not necessarily a one-on-one, it may be, or you may have multiple questions related to the single authentic resource. So for this case, you can see the question, what is the primary purpose of this infographic? And who is the most likely audience of this information? You'll see in the guidance that it gives you information about how to write directions and how to structure the multiple choice questions. For being able to copy this and distribute it to students in black and white, you want to remember to convert your image to grayscale before copying. And if you're not certain about how to do that, that would be something that you would want to have one of your tech people support you in being able to do to make it highly readable to the learners after it's been copied. Here's an example of interpretive listening that's multiple choice. And what I'm showing you on the screen is that I took a YouTube video and I captured its script. A lot of YouTube videos, you can get the script right from YouTube, or you can use AI. I went to TWE and I grabbed the text that way. And I took the script. You'll see the script to be used for this item. It's in pale blue in the target language and darker blue in English for those of you who don't do Spanish. And what I want to show you is that, and Bill, if you'd click, you can see the words that are there are the actual words from the audio script. Then you will see that where I have the ellipsis or the 3 dots, this is where I deleted words from the script. This is referred to as chunking, something we talked about in the interpretive communication webinar back in the fall. Authentic resources may be chunked. Chunking with an audio resource is basically the use of selected portions of the authentic resource, which is what you see here. And so from this script, I have created a set of directions and then this question, what is the speaker's opinion of this tiny house? Again, very checkpoint A oriented. Similar to what I did with the infographic, with a single script, you may have more than one question, or from the larger transcript from the video, in this case, I created more than one script. So I have a second script here, and I have a second question. How does the speaker describe the kitchen? Another format for interpretive communication is the short answer format, also found in your writing quality assessment items guidance. So here is a wonderful infographic of a survey response. And I've determined that I'm not going to use the whole infographic. I'm just going to use portions of this infographic. So there's that chunking again, except the chunking this time is just using selected portions of an infographic or of a print text. So here you see my selected portions side by side with my directions and 3 questions. These are again short answer. This is what's referred to as a constructed response, where students are asked questions and then they write their answers. In this case, these are all in English. And by the way, I've made all of these questions and answers in English for this webinar because we have an audience that speaks a range of languages. Another format for constructed response interpretive communication is the completion format. So here's an ad for buying a gift card to a park in Paris, and you can see the directions and then completion, where I've begun a statement and the learners will finish filling it in with understandings they have from from the authentic resource. You'll notice in the instructions that there may be more than one correct answer. So that's a really key idea. We don't ever want to design assessment items that are predicated on a single word, but rather where learners can pull from their general understandings or from multiple words. And another constructed response design is image selection. Actually, that should say multiple choice, not constructed response. My apologies. And so what I have done is I've gone to an authentic website, which look at these amazing images. So I've determined these will be fabulous images for my students to be able to use image selection. Although it wasn't originally audio, I can use this text to create an audio script. And so I've selected snippets of the text that was written to use as my audio text with these 3 images. So again, you see my script over at left. You can see that I've eliminated a few words. Those are the ellipses, the little 3 dots. And then I've given my learners the 3 images, and they will choose which image is being described. And I've decided I'm going to use this same image set more than once because there's more content from that online article from which I can create a second script. And another potential design for an interpretive assessment item is the use of a graphic organizer. I want you to notice over in the left-hand column, I've put some really common graphic organizer designs. The concept map, the sequence, the T-chart, and the Venn diagram. Certainly, a benchmark assessment would not be the time to introduce a graphic organizer that your students weren't already highly familiar with. So here's an example in French, the Quebec Carnival Bonhomme Carnaval. This is his identity card. And so I've created a concept map of a graphic organizer in that who, what, where, when, why, how format. And so the who is in the center, and we've already answered it because we've told the students that
My
this is
jacket's
about,
upstairs
please,
next to my
mute your
dresser.
Thank you. So we've already told the students who this is about, and now they're going to gather information from the identity card to answer a where, a when, a what, and in this case, a how big. And similarly, there are multiple possible responses that the students are able to grab from the authentic resource. And in this case, we've asked them to do that in English. And clearly for the graphic organizer and perhaps for the short answer or the completion, depending on how it's designed, you're going to need a way to know if the students have met the criteria because it's not quite a clean right wrong. So you may choose to use the New York State World Language Master rubric for Novice High. And again, Novice High is the target, but passing would still need to be novice mid. And you'll find the master rubrics in our folder. I should have put the folder icon up there, forgot about that. And I want to point out at the bottom that if you're not familiar with these rubrics, if you haven't been using them, then you would want to watch the webinar that we recorded in the fall of 2022 called Creating Standards Aligned Rubrics for Performance Assessment Tasks. I've hyperlinked it here. These slides will be made available to you after today's session. And so clicking on that will take you right to where you can find the recording of that webinar. And of course, if the culture standards are assessed, for example, in any of those constructed responses where you're using the rubrics, then definitely pull in the domains that are applicable from the culture standards rubrics. Target, novice high, passing, novice mid. A checklist format is also a possibility, and this is the last interpretive format we'll be sharing with you. Again, you will find information about it in the Writing Quality Assessments document. So here we have a video of someone giving the recipe in Italian for focaccia di pane, and I've taken the transcript of the video. I've excerpted a piece of it to create an authentic video script, taken out a couple words, that's where those three dots are, and given the directions for our students to listen to the script of someone describing the recipe. And I'm going to show you two different approaches to the checklist. This one is pairing ingredients, where it's an either or. So the students are listening for the ingredients and determining, is it, for example, old bread or fresh bread, water or oil, tomatoes or onions, salt or pepper, cheese or olives. Or the alternative would just be to give that list of ingredients, having them check off the ingredients that they hear. My only worry about this one is that if a student doesn't know a single word, they might not necessarily capture all of the answers. So that's why I personally prefer the other version. But this is one your students may be very, very familiar with and you're very comfortable with. So those are a multiplicity of item types for designing and creating assessments for interpretive communication. I'm now going to turn you over to Bill Heller, who will talk to you about interpersonal communication.
So the interpersonal items will be based on conversations that you'll have with the student, usually again prior to the administration of the written portions of the test. Similar formats to what we do now. But there are some expansions on that that we'll talk about. This section will be worth 30% of the entire assessment. This section we want to have assess the student's ability to communicate in two, could be more, unrehearsed short conversations at the novice high level. They reflect highly familiar contexts and situations within the student's experiences. And though that language comes right from the performance indicators for novice, mid, and high for interpersonal communication standard 2. It asks the students to fulfill a communicative purpose. And as you'll see, each of the tasks that sample tasks that I present will very clearly define what the task is and what the purpose of the task is. The students always play themselves. If there's any role playing to be done, the role play would be done by the part of the teacher. The teacher, and that's the next part. The teacher serves as the conversation partner. The teacher can play another role. I am your friend. I am the clerk at the store. Whatever. The teacher plays the part, but the student always plays themselves. We are two different types of tasks that we're proposing. First, a short, spontaneous role play situation, very similar to the kinds of tasks we have included in the speaking assessment now, and also a provision for a short, spontaneous interview. As with the other, the interpretive tasks, we have a guideline in the document for writing quality communication tasks, for oral interpretation tasks that guide you through how to develop a task, how to give the directions, suggestions for administration, and suggestions for the content. Here's an example of a role play task. This one's called It's Nice to Meet You. You and I were just introduced by a mutual friend. To get to know each other, we exchange information about ourselves. You start the conversation. You have 2 minutes to tell me about yourself and to find out about me. Notice how we've made very clear what the task is to be completed, because part of the evaluation of this task will be completing the task itself. So do they complete this task or not? So you have to be very clear to the student and to yourself on what the task is you're asking the student to do. The second type of interpersonal task that you could have would be the interview. Just a simple conversation, and where you're just two people having a conversation. This one's called Weekends. Let's have a conversation about what we usually do during the weekend. Again, this is definitely within the wheelhouse of a Checkpoint A student, within the performance and expectations of a novice speaker. And so we say, I start the conversation. You will have 2 minutes in which to tell me what you like to do on the weekend and find a little bit about me. Again, that keeps it interpersonal, where there's an exchange of information, where as opposed to something that's presentational where the student would just talk about their weekend. This is actually, they would have to kind of ask you as well, and it could be something as simple as, and you, what do you do? That type of thing. Now we give this guideline of 2 minutes, but the task, if the task is completed in less time, they can still get full credit. It doesn't mean they have to speak for 2 whole minutes. If you can get the task done and you get a good sample from them, it just goes quickly, then you have they can get full credit and they don't have to speak for the full 2 minutes. But you give them that time. And again, of course, if the student has modifications or in an IEP or 504, then you would give them extended time if necessary. And again, evaluation, any evaluation or scoring scheme that would be developed would be based on the language in the interpersonal rubric. And again, novice high being the target, and novice mid being still being able to get a passing score on this section. The language from the document is learners carry on 2 conversations which are evaluated on a rubric based on the language of the New York State World Language Master Rubric for novice high. So Lori will now take us through the presentational type tasks.
Thank you, Bill. So now let's talk about presentational tasks. We will start with the skill of writing, and this is to be scored somewhere between 15 and 30%. And so here we're going to assess the student's ability to write 2 or 3 short messages at novice high. Once again, you'll pick up the theme, which is these are highly familiar contexts and situations within the student's experiences, so things that they're comfortable communicating about. We want to ask students to fulfill a communicative purpose associated with presentational communication, particularly describing, sharing information or informing, and giving reasons or persuading. And you can see we have multiple tasks that we're going to give you some examples so you can get a sense for what describing, sharing information, and giving reasons might look like in a presentational writing task. We will also talk a bit about presentational speaking, though you see that this is optional should you choose to do presentational speaking. Once again, we want students to respond to a prompt, orally in this case, following the preparation for novice high, reflect highly familiar contexts and situations, again, within the student's experience, And we're looking for those communicative purposes. So again, associated with presentational communication, in this case, describing, in other words, perhaps an authentic image, narrating a series of authentic images, or informing or sharing information, perhaps, for example, leaving a voicemail. We'll start with written presentational tasks. Once again, you'll see that there is a guide for writing quality presentational completion tasks, where you have information about the task description and directions, format and administration, and of course, content. So you have that in your folder. Let's start with presentational writing. Here is an example of a describing task. So students will see this image. The context is they are studying in France as an exchange student, and you tore your backpack. That sounds very checkpoint A to me. Your host parents wants to buy you a replacement and emails you a link to the ad at right. We're asking students to describe the specific backpack that they want in an email message. For these tasks, we're providing a list of things that students might want to include, might wish to include. And this, of course, will prompt them into thinking how to respond. This is not that they have to include all of these elements, but oftentimes kids at checkpoint A might be stymied, might have to think a little bit. And so this just gives them a sense for what they might write about. And you can see they're all pretty typical things given this context. So they might want to greet their host parent, talk about the color of the backpack, the design, the size of the backpack, what they need to carry in the backpack that would impact their choice, the classes that they have in school, appreciation for the help in purchasing this new backpack. This is an authentic resource that you see here from an online store in France. And so students are going to use that to prompt their response. We're asking them to write an email of 3 to 5 sentences in the space provided, and this might be worth 10 points. Another presentational writing task, in this case with the language function of sharing information. In this case, we want students to think about an exchange student in their school from Italy. And they want to make this student feel at home. And so they're going to organize an Italian movie night. Here's the context. We're asking them, the task we're asking them to complete is share information on your class group chat about the party. That's the task, and you see it's in bold and italics here so that it's clear what they need to accomplish in this message. So again, we're providing them with ideas to think about. They may wish to include the reason for the party, the time it will begin and end, the location, the kinds of movies they're going to see, very important, the snacks and drinks that they'll be serving, games they might play, and how to respond to the invitation for the party. Here we're asking students to write a chat post of 3 to 5 sentences. And again, this could be worth 10 points. And then finally, for presentational writing, we wanted to share an example of giving reasons. In this one, you have a key pal from Austria who sent an email telling you they would like to visit your town. And they want to know when the best time to travel would be. So here, you're going to respond to that email from your key pal by giving the reasons for the season that you recommend. Again, a list of suggested ways they might respond or content they might include. They might talk about the months, write about the months of the season that they choose that are included in that season, the activities that their friend might be able to do during that season, the weather, the kinds of clothing that they might need, and the holidays and celebrations that happen during the season. Again, this is not a list that they must check off and complete each and every one of these. They're meant to prompt students' thinking. And here we're asking them to write an email of 3 to 5 sentences, again, worth possibly 10 points. For oral presentational tasks, once again, you have a guidance document with all of the information for writing quality tasks, again, including description and directions, format and administration, and content. And these, of course, are for presentational speaking. One example you might consider is describing. And in this case, the students received photos from their pen pals Their Cuban pen pal sent this photo of their family, their home, their neighborhood. We're asking students to describe what they see in the photo to their classmates. Again, you may wish to think about including things like the people you see and their family relationships, the clothing that the people are wearing, the homes on the street, the furniture and other objects that they see, rooms that the furniture might have come from, the weather in the photo, again, all meant to prompt students' thinking. In this case, they would record a description of 3 to 5 sentences, possibly worth 5 points. Another presentational speaking task under the skill of narrating would be looking at this image, and this is an authentic image from Ecuador, from a school in the Galapagos. And the context is an Ecuadorian exchange student in your school shared this photo of their school schedule back home in the Galapagos. The task, again, in bold and italics, narrate your school day for your friend. So once again, they're talking about their own school day. You may wish to include the classes you take during the week, the times each class meets, which classes come first, next, and last, which classes are in the morning, which are in the afternoon, and again, asking them to record a narration of 3 to 5 sentences for 5 points. And finally, again, presentational speaking, looking at sharing information. In this task, we're talking about a Senegalese friend who is going to meet with you after school to study. That's the context. The task, in italics and bold, call and leave a voicemail sharing information with details about your study plans. You may wish to include when you plan to meet, where you plan to meet, directions for how to get to the location, different options for transportation, what your friend should bring, what you will be studying, and who will join you in the study session. Again, a voicemail, we ask students to record a voicemail to give it that context of 3 to 5 sentences for potentially 5 points. As in our other examples, we are looking at a target using our rubrics, which we highly encourage you to do. Have a look at these master rubrics with our target of novice high, but passing at novice mid. That was a lot. Let's revisit today's goals and see how you feel about them, and then we will open up to questions. So we hope that you can identify purposes and guiding principles for Checkpoint A benchmark assessments. I can identify the guidelines for Checkpoint A benchmark assessment, development, and implementation. And finally, I can identify the assessment formats and task designs for sections associated with each of the New York State Learning Standards for World Languages.